Tell me when you're ready, Sharon.
Go.
Okay. So yesterday on the Liberty Lineup radio show, Kristen Chevrier had a guest speaker who is a physicist, and he was talking on this subject. And I heard him say this quote. He said, "I would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned." It's attributed mostly to this physicist, Richard Feynman. Anyway, and it resonated with me, not only for what that means in terms of how we approach science education, but it resonated with me because my experience as a mom trying to affect what's happening in my kids' school. I feel that there's a lot of deference to titles and degrees and experts, and because my title is mom, then I can't ask questions, or my questions aren't valid. So anyway, I think it's important that we, in a self-governing country, don't ignore good questions, no matter where they come from. So this is just a little review of where we're at. As Sharon said, I've been involved in kind of pushing back against Common Core for a number of years, and it actually was just not too many years ago that I stood in this very room shaking Governor Herbert's hand as he looked me in the eye and promised, we're not nationalizing education. These aren't going to be national standards. It's just math and English. We would never do science, social studies, history, these other subjects. So here we are, and Utah already adopted national science standards called the Next Generation Science Standards for grades 6 through 8. And on February 2nd, the Standards and Assessment Subcommittee voted to recommend the Next Generation Science Standards to the full board, and that full board discussion and vote will be on March 15th. So as you can see, we have almost exactly a month to get the word out. I think most people aren't even aware that this is happening. And I'm glad to see Elisa Ellis is one of the state board members who was on that subcommittee, and she was the only one who voted no, but more importantly, she was the only one in the hearing who asked questions. And I think that's really important. I know I'm preaching to the choir in this group. This is a group that's really aware of the importance of policy and procedure and rule of law versus rule by man, because that helps things stay a little safer in terms of government. So here are the steps for our standards adoption for the science standards. Step 1, train the teachers on the new standards. Wendy can correct me, I think it was 2015.
It was 6 months prior to whenever the board saw those grade 6 through 8 standards.
So 6 months before even we were considering the new standards for the grades that we have adopted for them, they were having teacher training on these new standards. So step 2, arrange tests for these new standards. We recently signed a contract with the testing provider for that kind of puts us in a group of other states. And so the test questions will be shared with all these other states who have already adopted these next generation science standards. So again, it's kind of locking us into the standards long before step 3 that we're just beginning now. Start the public review process for selecting new standards. So it makes me say, whoa, who's really driving this part? Are we a self-governing citizenry still? So during that hearing, one of the questions that came up that I'm still not certain what the answer is, Lisa said, the Fordham Foundation, so it's a foundation that does kind of a third-party review of standards, and they compare standards, and they've done this for many years. But they did a review of science standards. They compared the next generation science standards to standards from 55 from all the other states, and then there's several others that are just done by organizations that aren't linked to a state. So there's 55 other sets, and they ranked them 26 out of 56, and they ranked them a C grade, mostly for inadequate content. So the question was, these have a C grade, there's all these other options, were any other standards, including Utah's current standards, which were ranked higher, considered when we opened this up for review to update our standards? And there were two responses. One was from a gentleman who was on the recommendation committee with Vince, and he said, well, these are the standards that are being recommended by these national science organizations. So he just kind of acted like it was inevitable. Like, why would we consider anything else that didn't come from these organizations? And then at the end, our state science director kind of said, I'm going to come back and respond to this. And he said, well, all these other states that had higher standards have already switched. Everybody else is doing it. So here's my tip to state Office of Education people. When you're recommending new science standards to Utah parents, do not assume that this is a good reason. I don't know how many times my mom, who's in the audience today, told me, you know, Mom, everybody's doing it. And she'd say something like, if all your friends were jumping off a cliff, would you do it too?
That's right.
Anyway, so come on, we're all moms and dads in this room, and this excuse isn't going to cut it. We can't change the whole education in our state because it's just what everybody's doing, right? So these standards aren't called Common Core, but a friend of mine did this. If you love Common Core math, then you'll love Next Generation Science Standards. Brought to you by Achieve Inc., spurring up your kids' education since 1996. And so kind of tongue-in-cheek, but the point is that whatever we call these standards, they're owned, copyrighted and owned and led by the exact same group that did Common Core math and language arts. So what's different about these standards? I want to go right to some of the proponents of the standards themselves, because I think the real reason that no other standards were considered is this. And I'm just going to play this video for a minute. Hopefully the sound will work.
Just one. Just tap it
Yeah,
instead of wait.
Sorry, we did a test run and it worked.
I'd like to start with this. We've had standards before. What makes this different? What makes these standards different?
Okay, I'll try one answer. I think there are many answers. I think both Common Core and Next Generation Science Standards embody a shift in the way a classroom works, away from teacher as information giver and towards students as learners working together, discourse among students in the classroom coming up, and teacher talk going down. That's a huge change, particularly from what we've been doing these last few years. And having that change happen across all subject areas, so it's a change of school culture and not just in one subject area, is really, really important.
Well, and I think also, as you kind of think about where we are today, you can go on your portable whatever, and you can punch in the question you want, as we were seeing in the video this morning, and there's the answer. It's not about today and for our kids' future. Remember, we're trying to get kids to be prepared for the future. And it's not about just knowing the information. It's about what you do with it. And so what is so exciting and unique about the NGSS standards, and about Common Core, and about the English, the ELA, and the math, it's really trying to get kids to think about what's the information I have, and now what do I do with it? And then when you start looking at the NGSS and you have the cross-cutting concepts, think about, when you when they sent Curiosity to Mars, what would they?
He kind of goes on and on, so I'm going to stop there. But there's two things. First is this, that I've heard a lot. I heard it last week in another education presentation. They're talking about why we need to shift from knowledge-based learning to social and emotional learning. And they said, kids don't need to know the dates of the Civil War. They can Google all of those facts. They need to know who they are, and what their purpose is, and how they relate to other people. And my question is, why else do we teach history? Other than to know, as human beings, how we've related to each other in the past, who we are in context of the times, who people are. I think that's important. We're seeing a really big disconnect. And so what he said also about, you don't need to know these, really know facts. You can go and look up facts, and it's about constructing knowledge from the facts that you can gather. And first of all, I don't think that's how the brain works, and I'm going to show in a minute what the research says about that. But also, how do you know when you don't know what you don't know? How can you go out and search for something that you don't know, So anyway, I don't know if that makes any sense, but what the woman said first is the real reason why no other standards were considered. And that is, under the guise of a standards update, we are adopting a complete new pedagogy. It's a major shift from what we believed about how people learn and what is, the way we teach. Like he said, we are really discounting the idea of a teacher as someone who has more experience and who can be a mentor or a guide, and we're saying no more sage on the stage. We're going to have a guide on the side, and the kids are going to lead their own learning. And there are some, there's some grains of truth in there that the research show, but it's really important to understand that we're not just adopting new science standards. Like she said, we're changing the whole culture of education. So we need to be really sure if this is a good move. The local science director in my school district, when I was talking about some of my objections to this, they kind of laugh a little bit, and they're like, what? Science is science. What's it matter? The theory of relativity isn't different in Texas as it is in Utah and stuff like that. And that's not the point. The point is, I think that's a really trite thing to say. Science is science. That's like saying, what am I going to feed my baby? Food is food. It matters what food you give to a baby and how much and how it's presented. I think that that's an important thing to consider in education. It's how we are presenting it. And the big shift from next generation science standards, again, is it's not kind of collected in discipline areas or areas of different disciplines. So it's not chemistry, biology, life sciences, and physics, and it's just kind of a mix of a lot of things, these cross-cutting concepts as they call it. And some are really heavily represented, and many are completely absent. So I think we have to, as parents, take a look at that and what we value. So back to the research. This is a paper, it was a journal article in Educational Psychologist. And the reason I like this one is it's kind of a collection of many different controlled control group research that compared this constructivist view of learning versus a more direct instruction approach where kids are actually led to understand specific fundamental principles versus discovering themselves. So just to kind of give an idea, a constructivist theory is a shift of emphasis away from teaching a discipline as a body of knowledge toward an exclusive emphasis on learning a discipline by experiencing the processes and procedures of the discipline. And this is exactly what the Next Generation Science Standards is trying to do. They're saying we want kids to just think like scientists, and we're just gonna give them these problems to solve, and they're gonna construct their own knowledge as they go. And then the paper concludes, the major fallacy of this rationale is it makes no distinction between behaviors and methods of a researcher who is an expert practicing a profession and those students who are essentially novices. And there's just so much information here. It talks about, cognitive science, how we know the long-term memory works, how we know how the working memory works, how they work back and forth, and it kind of goes back to that Google reference, and that is, do you really know something if you're looking it up? And what's the difference between something you know and how does that affect what you can do with it? So one example that I love to share is, like Sharon mentioned, I worked at a software company, and one of the engineers that I worked with, he had a degree in physics, but he was a computer programmer and a really, really good problem solver and smart guy. And there was some networking issue, and he was able to apply the algorithm for the half-life or decay of an atom to solve a networking issue. And that's creative problem solving. I think that's the kind of thing, when we talk about critical thinking, that we're after. I think that's what companies want, parents want. We want creative thinkers. But the point was, he had to own some knowledge. You have to, in order to construct knowledge, you have to have some building materials. And you have to have some fundamentals that you have. And because he owned that knowledge, he was able to apply it in a new way and make connections. And basically that's what the brain science shows us, that when we own the knowledge, then we're able to make connections to new and novel areas. And that's the higher level thinking that we're after. But all these constructivist approaches want to jump right to that level and ignore the foundation of the cognitive science. And another comment that was made in the subcommittee hearing that was really concerning is one of the guys said, there's a preponderance of evidence why this works. And I was waiting, I'm like, where's this evidence? I've been looking. Where's the preponderance of evidence for why this works? And he said, my own kids went to this workshop and they loved it. Well, here's one of the, out of all the pages and pages, I pulled this one out. So controlled experiments almost uniformly indicate that when dealing with novel information, learners should be explicitly shown what to do. So that's talking about the knowledge base. That experiment after experiment, and this is decades long, clear back to the 60s, they went to and did experiments. And they showed over and over and over again that when you're new to an area or you're a novice, you need to have some fundamentals before you can move up to constructing knowledge. So this is the next one. I skipped ahead a little bit. So this Clark, he did a couple of studies, and he showed that he argued that the failure to provide strong learning support for less experienced or less able students could actually produce a measurable loss in learning. Basically, kids were performing worse on the post-test than they did on the pre-test. There was actually kind of a degree of confusion that was happening through this method of teaching. And it's curious to me because right now we're seeing the early adopters of next generation science standards, their test scores are falling. And the one that's most interesting to me is Rhode Island, because they were an early adopter of next generation science standards, but they didn't align their tests at the same time. They actually took the same test that they took before. So it's unique in the country that they actually used the same measuring stick before and after they made the switch. And their test scores fell dramatically, and they called the gap between the able students and the struggling students widened. So it's kind of just a real world current example of exactly what this study would predict. And back to what the parents said, even more distressing is the evidence Clark presented that when learners are asked to select between a more or less unguided version of the same course, less able learners who choose less guided approaches tend to like the experience